Hi, everyone, and thanks for listening to another episode of Saltivation. Today, again, we've got Stacey, Alex, Tram, and Meredith. And we were kind of thinking as we were kind of noodling on some stuff to think about that one of the recurring themes that we're seeing here of late is manufacturing in a lot of various capacities from industry perspectives, exemption certificates, definitions, sourcing for income tax purposes, and also, how this ties into, even from for federal tax purposes, 174 capitalization of R&D costs, where a lot of manufacturers also have research and development costs. So regardless of whether or not you are taking a research and development credit, you will still be subject to, as a result of TCJA, capitalization of R&D costs. So a lot of kind of manufacturing expenditures are kind of on the top of a lot of people's minds, and it was just a recurring theme. And Tram, I think you just got back from a conference where, again, manufacturing came up. So if you want to kind of give it a briefing on what you heard, we'll go from there.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I was at an ABA tax meeting last week, and manufacturing was brought up in terms of, the salt implications, especially from, you mentioned sales tax exemption perspective, because, in many states, there is a manufacturing exemption. If you qualify as a manufacturer, and your processes may be eligible, for the exemption, but every state is very different in terms of how they define what manufacturing is and what they will exempt, what piece of the process they exempt. But more importantly, what they brought up last week was, what other things in terms of like traditional manufacturing, like you're building a widget, versus kind of non-traditional processes such as the renewable, like wind, solar, and hydro, renewable energy sources. And so I think kind of thinking about whether or not, for example, generating electricity is considered manufacturing. I think, depending on how the state statute is written, some states could consider, some of these renewable energy sources, right, generating the wind energy or solar energy as, exempt. But I think the key thing I would take away is that, you really have to dig into the statute and look at the definition, right? What is it? And look at the specific tax treatment of that particular activity and really kind of scrutinize whether or not it would really be considered manufacturing. So I feel like that was a big takeaway, because these are industries that are, more of the cutting edge. A lot of people are now, aware or more, mindful of being more, earth friendly or whatever. So I feel like these are big areas for us to watch out for.
Yeah, and I would say even in traditional manufacturing, I went in-house to a manufacturing or more traditional manufacturing company a few years ago. And what I thought was interesting is just going back to what you just said, Tram, about like the definitions and how we would go through, maybe sales tax audits between states. And I mean, I think Texas is a good example of, in Trams in Texas, of like kind of, if you're in a continuous process in a manufacturing process, then you might qualify. All those, steps may qualify. However, if you're moving goods, from one step to the process in like a conveyor to another step in the process, Texas doesn't say that conveying is actually part of the manufacturing process, whereas maybe another state would. And so it's really, really important to understand those rules, because perhaps, some equipment would be exempt in some states, but not in others.
Well, and then also not just for the sales tax side, but like I know one of the things I learned was that Texas will exempt certain, items in the solar energy sector for sales tax purposes, but for franchise tax, The exemption is more narrow. So it has to be very specific, kind of like what you're saying. Where is it in the process? So in Texas, they specifically said you'll have that Texas franchise exemption only if you're in the business of manufacturing, selling, or installing the solar devices, as opposed to kind of the ecosystem, right? Like if you're, tracking, or if you're providing support posts or whatever, to enable, right, the generation of that energy, for sales tax, you might be eligible, but not for franchise purposes. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, just a lot of things to think about, because even Stacey and I were talking about in related to Massachusetts apportionment purposes. Massachusetts goes to a single sales factor for those that I think the rule is greater than 50% of your sales come from products that you manufacture under Section 38. And I think a lot of these manufacturing things have crossover ties to definitions with the IRC. And so as state tax practitioners, in some areas we do have to rely on the IRC as our starting point or our basis, but how much of that is there? And we all know that it's really easy to read the IRC and those regs. So I think, just realistically, much like everything in state tax, it's an evolution. Under a definitional perspective, you could be one thing in one state, not in the other. Colorado has a state manufacturing exemption. A lot of the locals don't. So just, as items are being scrutinized, people are trying to find ways to save money, providing exemption certificates. Manufacturing is touching a lot of our lives and a lot of the tax components. So just wanted to throw out some things to think about, as we are thinking about them. So thank you everyone for stopping by and listening to us talk manufacturing, and we'll see you next time.